Hello, I'm Bruno Taillet, PhD student at Sorbonne University and BNP Paribas. Today, I present my work on incorrect comparison in end-to-end relation extraction. Joint work with Vincent Guigues, Geoffrey Scouteten, and Patrick Gallinari. Name entity recognition and relation extraction are two key information extraction tasks, for example at the heart of knowledge graph construction. Given a sentence, we would like to extract the mentions of entities as well as the relations expressed between them. In end-to-end relation extraction, a single model is trained to perform both tasks and to model their interdependency. Numerous articles have proposed different models. However, because several evaluation setups have been used, some of them present incorrect performance comparison to previous work. Our main goal in this article is to raise awareness on this issue, but in order to be useful to larger audience, I will first perform a quick literature review and then come to our more specific point. Before tackling joint entity and relation extraction, let's see how we would perform both tasks in a pipeline approach. We would first perform name entity recognition, often modeled as sequence labeling. For each word, we predict a tag that is reflective of both the type of the entity and the position of the word inside the mention. The classical neural architecture to do so is the Bayesian CRF. Today, we would more likely fine-tune a simple classifier over a pre-trained language model. NER can also be viewed as a span-level classification task, which is useful for nested or overlapping mentions. All possible substances are separately classified as entity mentions or not. Given the output of NER, relation extraction is then cast as classification of every pair of detected entities. Such a classifier takes as input a pair of entities and the context sentence, and it must predict which relation is expressed between the entities. One popular architecture to do so is piecewise pooling, where the sentence is split into 5 parts, the two entities, and 3 subsentences before, between, and after the entities. Each part is pooled into a fixed length representation, and their concatenation is fed to a classifier. Today, we can also simply feed BERT with the concatenation of the candidate entities and the sentence, and we use the CLS token to train a classifier. So this gives us the pipeline approach where two separate models are trained separately and applied sequentially. While this enables modularity, it also prevents from modeling the intuitive interdependency between tasks, and it leads to error propagation. And this is why joint models have been proposed. So the first approach is the incremental setting proposed by Lee and G. The sentence is parsed word by word, and for each word, we perform an entity step and a relation step. We begin with entity detection, and as soon as we have detected several entities, we can examine potential relations between them. Miwa and Sasaki proposed to cast this joint task as a table filling problem. They noticed that the entire information we want to extract can be represented as a table, where the diagonal contains information on entities and the other cells information on relations. The task can then be framed as sequence labeling. They explore several orders for this sequential filling, and we can see that if we begin with the diagonal, we perform entity first prediction, similarly to the pipeline approach, but we can also recover the incremental setting by changing this order. This setting has been used in several additional works, including a new work by Wang and Lu presented at this very conference and reporting new state-of-the-art results. In both incremental and table filling settings, the interdependency is modeled in the sequence of predictions. Another approach is to keep the pipeline structure but enable interactions in a shared encoder. Depending on the information shared by the decoders, we can distinguish two subclasses of models. The entity filtering models keep the pipeline approach, and the NER outputs are explicitly used to perform relation classification of every pair. In multi-head selection models, the decoders do not directly share information, or they share less explicit information such as NER label embeddings. In this case, the model must make a relation prediction for each pair of words, similarly to table filling. However, the table is not filled sequentially, but in 2 steps, entities, then relations. So we can see that there are several works that use entity filterings. first with sequence tagging NER, but also span level NER, and we can note that entity filtering is the only approach that enables tackling overlapping entities. And we can also see that several work use multi-head selection. Finally, on a more original note, Lee and colleagues frame end-to-end relation extraction as multi-turn question answering. Each relation corresponds to a template of several questions that are answered one after the other with a BERT-based QA model. So this gives us an overview of proposed models with very diverse approaches, and we can note an evolution from incremental settings to shared encoder settings. Simultaneously, the representations used by these models have followed the general NLP trend and went from handcrafted to non-contextual embeddings and finally language model pre-training. We can wonder now which elements among all these different proposals are the most useful for end-to-end relation extraction. And one tool to answer that is a common benchmark and common metrics. However, several settings have been used to evaluate end-to-end relation extraction. In all settings, we generally report two scores, one for NER that takes into account the detection of every entity, whether involved in a relation or not, and one for relation extraction, only focused on the relations. So we use precision recall and F1 for both, but this information is not sufficient to entirely describe the evaluation setting. Indeed, Bekulis and colleagues identify three different settings: strict, boundaries, and relaxed. The strict setting is the most restrictive, requiring that both the entity type and boundaries are correctly detected for both NER and relation extraction. In the boundary settings, the NER evaluation is unchanged, but only the boundaries of relation arguments are taken into account for relation extraction. In the relaxed setting, a multi-token entity is correct if at least one token is assigned with correct type, with no requirements on the boundaries. NER is reduced to type classification with the assumption that entity boundaries are obtained in a separate process. While having several evaluation settings is not problematic in itself, this multiplication brings confusion, and it has led to several incorrect comparisons. So in our paper, we identify several incorrect comparisons with respect to previous works. So the first cause is a confusion between boundaries and strict settings, mainly on ACE datasets. Another issue is dataset alteration due to different preprocessing. And this issue is particularly critical for datasets which are not publicly available, such as ACE datasets, and for which only preprocessing scripts are shared. Furthermore, there can also be confusion between micro and macro average scores, as this norm differs between evaluation setups or even between datasets. And we can also mention more insidious issues that are less specific to end-to-end relation extraction. For example, confusing different train and test splits, using only the train split versus retraining on additional development data, and finally reporting the results of a single best run versus averaging multiple runs. We invite you to find more details in the paper where we report a curated list of published results on 5 datasets. So now, in the final part of this work, we propose a small empirical study to quantify the impact of such differences in evaluation. We mainly focus on comparing boundaries and strict results, which is the most common mistake. We chose a simple entity filtering baseline inspired by the recent work of Ebert 2020. But to obtain results more broadly representative of different trends, we vary two elements. So first, the encoder is either BERT or a more traditional BiLSTM with non-contextual embeddings. And second, NER is either cast as span-level classification or sequence tagging. We perform our experiments on ACE-05 and CONNEL-04, the two main benchmarks for end-to-end relation extraction. So first, our small study suggests that span-level NER is not beneficial on non-overlapping entities, contrary to what have been claimed. Second, we can see that language model pre-training is the main source for improved results. Furthermore, we evaluate that reporting boundary scores instead of strict scores results in a plus 3% relative improper gain on ACE-05, but surprisingly it has a very limited impact on CONNEL-04, and this regardless of the different architecture. And this can be explained by one overlooked difference between these two datasets. That is the fact that there is a bijective mapping between relation and argument types in CONNEL. And this experiment suggests that models have learned this mapping or even use it as a shallow heuristic. And we can see that this mapping is much more complex in ACE. So to conclude, we can only call for more complete reports of the evaluation settings, including every metric subtlety, as well as dataset statistics. In this regard, we are in complete adequation with the EMNLP 2020 reproducibility checklist. But we also think that it would be beneficial to unify the evaluation settings by always reporting both strict and boundary scores, which could enable more meaningful cross-dataset analysis. On a final point, we believe that a single F1 score is not enough to analyze and understand the performance of a model. And we can point to several works that measure, for example, the impact of lexical overlap in span-based tasks, or even two works presented at this conference on shallow heuristics in neural relation extraction models. Thank you for your attention.